He didn't just change economics. He changed the way governments think about fear, power, and money. John Maynard Keynes wasn't a politician or a revolutionary. He was something far rarer, a man who taught nations how to spend their way out of despair. For centuries, debt was a sin. Deficits were moral failures. Balanced budgets were the sign of honest governance. But Keynes flipped this moral script. He told governments that spending in hard times wasn't reckless. It was responsible. He made debt sound like a duty and saving sound selfish. And by doing so, he rewired the logic of capitalism. Welcome to Paper Empire's history. Today we tell the story of the man who wrote the operating system of the modern world.
The story begins in the ashes of the Great Depression. Imagine the world in 1930. Banks collapsing, factories silent, millions jobless. The old economic playbook, built on Adam Smith and the invisible hand, said the market would fix itself. Supply and demand would rebalance, prices would fall, and recovery would be automatic. But theory doesn't feed a starving family. In the real world, demand didn't come back. People, terrified, stopped spending entirely. The economy wasn't correcting, it was freezing. Keynes looked at this world and realized something radical. Markets are not perfect. Sometimes they get stuck in a feedback loop of fear. When people stop spending, businesses stop hiring. When businesses stop hiring, incomes fall. When incomes fall, spending collapses even further. It is a spiral. What the economy lacked wasn't discipline or thrift, it was aggregate demand. Keynes called this the paradox of thrift. What is wise for a single household, saving money, becomes a disaster when everyone does it at the same time. Because one person's spending is another person's income. When spending dies, the heartbeat of the economy stops. Keynes proposed something heretical. If private demand collapses, public demand must replace it. The government must step in, borrow money, hire workers, build projects, and put cash back into circulation. To the old economists, this was madness. Debt was a curse. But Keynes saw it differently. He wasn't saying debt was good. He was saying timing mattered. Governments should act counter-cyclically. Spend in a crisis, save in a boom. The economy is like a car. Normally, the private sector drives. But when the engine stalls, it is the government's job to turn the key.
At first, leaders clung to the old religion of austerity. Britain and Germany cut spending, created chaos. In the U.S., Herbert Hoover waited for the market to fix itself. It didn't. Then Franklin D. Roosevelt entered the stage. With the New Deal, the government became the nation's largest customer. It hired millions to build dams and roads. It injected money directly into the bloodstream of the economy. Slowly, it worked. But to prove Keynes's ideas beyond debate, something much larger and darker was needed: war. When World War II erupted, governments did exactly what Keynes urged. They spent without hesitation. Factories reopened for tanks and planes. Governments borrowed massively, not for stimulus, but for survival. And for the first time in history, in the middle of a global crisis, unemployment vanished. The irony was brutal. Total war became the ultimate experiment in Keynesian economics, and it worked. Production soared. Incomes rose. Economies roared, even as bombs fell. When the war ended, Keynes's theories were no longer just accepted. They became the gospel. The Bretton Woods system, the welfare state, the golden age of growth from 1945 to 1973, they all carried his fingerprints.
Keynes had given capitalism a second life. But like every great idea, this carried a hidden cost. Because once a system learns that spending can solve any crisis, it also learns that restraint can be postponed forever. As governments used spending to smooth out downturns, stopping became difficult. Politicians discovered that voters loved the feeling of stimulus, but hated the discipline of saving. Keynes's golden rule, run a surplus in good times, was conveniently forgotten. By the 1970s, the machine began to overheat. When the oil shocks hit, the world learned the limits of Keynesian control. Stagflation, high inflation plus high unemployment, was theoretically impossible, but it happened. Governments tried to spend their way out, but this time, spending only made prices worse. Faith was shaken. Milton Friedman and the monetarists took the stage. They argued that inflation was always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Keynes looked dead, but economic theories don't die. They mutate. The idea that the government must intervene never left. It just waited for the next crisis. That crisis came in 2008. When global markets crashed, the old reflex returned. Governments that preached fiscal discipline suddenly rediscovered the power of spending. Bailouts, quantitative easing, QE, these were all steroid-injected versions of Keynes's playbook. Trillions were printed. Interest rates hit zero. Central banks didn't guide the economy. They became the economy. It worked again, but with a difference. Keynesian theory assumed money would reach workers and factories, the real economy. But in the 21st century, money flows differently. Stimulus didn't flood factory floors. It flooded financial markets. It didn't inflate wages. It inflated asset prices. Stocks and housing soared, inequality exploded. The government had learned to restart the engine, but it was turbocharging the wrong side of the system. When the pandemic arrived, Keynes was resurrected in his purest form. Governments printed trillions overnight. Checks went straight into bank accounts. It was an experiment in fiscal adrenaline. For a moment, it felt like magic, but then the bill arrived: inflation. Keynes designed a tool to stabilize capitalism. But what happens when that tool becomes the system itself? Today, almost a century after the general theory, the problem is that Keynes's logic is everywhere. Every time growth slows, governments reach for the same lever: borrow, spend, inflate, repeat. But each rescue leaves the economy a little more dependent, a little more leveraged, and a little more fragile. The state is no longer the spender of last resort. It is the spender of first resort. The balance Keynes imagined, discipline in boom, support in crisis, has been replaced by permanent stimulus. Yet his genius stands. Keynes didn't give governments a blank check. He gave them a mirror. He showed that economics isn't just math. It is psychology and belief. When people lose confidence in the future, they stop spending and economies die. Keynes built a theory to keep that belief alive. But the haunting truth is this: the modern world runs on belief without boundaries. We have turned Keynes's medicine into an addiction. Today's markets don't fear recession. They fear withdrawal. Keynes once said, "In the long run, we are all dead." He meant it as a challenge for governments not to remain idle. But over time, it became an excuse, a license to borrow endlessly and push consequences into the future. John Maynard Keynes didn't destroy capitalism. He saved it. But in saving it, he also made it mortal, dependent, and fragile. The man who taught governments how to spend also taught them how to forget restraint.
If what I shared today helped you see the world from a different perspective, don't forget to subscribe. Because history always has an answer. You just need to look from the right angle.